Hello, I'm M.K.Davis. I want to talk a little bit about the Patterson Bigfoot film. More particularly, the Patterson Bigfoot itself. Now, there are a lot of bad images out there, or not so good images. But what a lot of people don't know is that there are a lot of good images out there also. Let's take a look at one. Now, this is a much better image, and it's a good example of the quality of the original film that Patterson took. Here's Roger Patterson himself with a few words.
I realize that the conception of these giant creatures, they're called Bigfoot, is a fantastic subject, and a lot of people scoff at it and don't believe it. But I believe it. I'm convinced that these creatures exist, and I'm going to prove it if it takes me the rest of my life.
Patterson never did get his proof, as he died prematurely of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in 1972. Or did he? And the reason I say that is sometimes help comes from the most unlikely of places. Let's talk about that a little bit. I was watching a lecture by a man named Jeremy De Silva, an anthropologist, and I was very startled to learn some things. He was discussing Australopithecines, a primitive form of human. He had made some discoveries, particularly about the foot of the Australopithecine. It was almost every individual was completely and totally flat-footed, and it resulted in some problems with their walking. They gave them an unusual walk, and he discusses it. Let's just listen to him.
Now, I've been working with a team trying to figure out how they moved. Their heels are quite odd. Their ankles are unusual. Their knee looks a lot like ours, but it's different in some peculiar ways. The hip joint looks like ours too, but not quite. There's these fascinating differences. And so I started working with a team of physical therapists, trying to think head to toe through this body how it would have worked in concert while this creature was walking around its landscape. I then involved a student who's interested in video game design, and we started animating this skeleton of how would it have moved. And we just published our results earlier this year. After 2 million years of being in the ground, this is Australopithecus sediba walking again. Now notice she has long arms, curved fingers, walking a lot like us, short steps relative to most people. So it's quite human-like until you get into this plane. There's a lot of rotation happening. She's doing what we would call hyperpronation. So if people walk or run in this manner, it predisposes us to injury. But those unusual anatomies of Australopithecus sediba were anatomical solutions to the very problems that humans face today if they walk this way. And so we think she was adapted to move in this particular manner.
Now let me show you something on the Patterson Bigfoot film. Take a look at this. The subject in the Patterson Bigfoot film has long been known to have an unusual walk, but perhaps this is why. If you'll look, you'll see the knee turn inward. This is hyperpronation. As Dr. De Silva mentioned, this was a trait of primitive man, Australopithecines in particular. They had this flat foot and this pronated knee and this wobbly walk where they kicked inwards. And let's look at the Patterson Bigfoot again. Look at the knee kick inward. It gives her that wobbly look to the knees and the hips. Now, did I hear Dr. De Silva say that they had long arms and curved fingers? Long arms and curved fingers? Let's take a look at Patty again. In this one frame from the Patterson film, you have long arms, curved fingers, and flat feet showing plainly in that film. Very much like the Australopithecines that he was mentioning that had the pronation. Well, Dr. De Silva went on to talk about another primitive human that he called Homo naledi. It too was an Australopithecus or Australopithecine. Apparently, a version of the Australopithecus or Australopithecine was found deep in a cave in South Africa called the Rising Star Cave. The fossils were found deep in this cave by spelunkers. If you look at this diagram here, you see that they had several places that they had to crawl, what they call a squeeze, only like a 10-inch squeeze, to get down in there. And they were very shocked to find these fossil bones just laying on top of the ground. So word got back to Dr. De Silva, and they sent a picture of the bones, and it shocked him because, well, I'll let him tell you.
And I'm glad it did, because I clicked on the picture, and this came across my screen. I was stunned, and my initial thought was, this can't be a fossil. That's not how we find these things. This has to be a recent person. We should contact the police. Maybe this was a lost caver, and these are their remains. But you study the anatomy a little bit more, and you realize that that can't be the case. So if we look at the teeth, for instance, here's a beautiful jaw right here. And one of the things to notice is how big those molars are, and they get bigger as you move to the back row of the teeth. So that's a really large wisdom tooth. Humans today, as much as we complain about our wisdom teeth and have them pulled out of our heads, they're typically not the largest of the molars. But in the past, in our ancestors who were snoutier, it was the largest of the molars, and that's what we're seeing here.
Well, let's listen to Dr. De Silva talk about some other discoveries, not just the teeth, but some of the other features that definitely takes you back to the Patterson film. Let's listen.
Hurst was working on the brain, and so the skulls were scanned, and we could do internal reconstructions of the brain, and again, it appeared as though it had a small brain shaped more like yours and mine. We had folks working on the teeth, and the teeth are strikingly human-like, except for those large third molars, and when researchers examined the internal structure of the teeth, looking at where the enamel meets the dentin, they had an enamel dentin shape or morphology that was different from anything anyone had ever seen before. It was entirely unique. Tracy Kivel from the University of Liverpool worked on the hand, and I brought the hand with me. The hand is super interesting. It has a long thumb, a thumb that would be useful for precision grip and even a power grip, but it has these wonderful curved fingers as well. Quite a primitive-looking hand that would be useful for grabbing onto, well, we assume, tree branches, or maybe little Homo naledi's grabbing onto their moms. They also had quite a shrugged shoulder that's more ape-like. I worked on the legs and the feet. We had a large team working on this material, and the legs and the feet are a lot like yours and mine. However, what was interesting about the feet is that all of the feet we found were from flat-footed individuals. It didn't appear as though any of the Homo naledi's had an arched structure to the foot, and the toes are long and curved. Otherwise, though, very, very human-like foot. And the legs are a lot like yours and mine, except the joints are tiny. And so from that, what we've inferred is that they could walk in an economical way. They could get from point A to point B like you and I can without using much energy, but they couldn't do it over long distances. They didn't have the joints that were adapted for dissipating forces over a long period of time and a long distance. So they didn't have endurance. So they probably had small home ranges.
You remember when Dr. De Silva referred to Australopithecines as millions of years old. And then he saw this picture of the bones in the cave, and he was shocked. They said, this just doesn't happen. That's a possibly, the police need to be called. And then he realized he was looking at the features of Australopithecines. So let's just let him talk a little bit about his realization about the age of these things and how shocking it was to him. Let's listen.
Based on the anatomy, based on the shape of the skull, based on the shrugged shoulders and the curved fingers, I was going around telling people that this is a better Homo habilis than Homo habilis, that this is your ancestor to Homo erectus. When we get a date of this fossil, it's going to be about 2 million years old, and we're going to be able to anchor the origin of the lineage that led to Homo sapiens in South Africa. And I was wrong. As the geologists got to work in this chamber and examined the different rock layers and used really creative techniques of extracting information from fragments of enamel and quartz crystals that were in the sediment, what they found was that Homo naledi didn't live 2 million years ago, didn't even live 1 million years ago. It lived, or at least these Homo naledis, lived 250,000 years ago, 250,000 years ago, which is not that long ago, and is right around when our own species, Homo sapiens, was evolving on that same continent.
Well, there you have it. You have an Australopithecine that has curved fingers, that has pronation of the knee, flat feet, heavy brow ridges, stooped shoulders, and that lived less than 250,000 years ago, which is nothing in geological time or in anthropological time. Suddenly, possibilities begin to exist that there may be living examples of this type of primitive human, or whatever you want to call them, still running around upon the earth. And perhaps what we see on the Patterson Bigfoot film might be a version of this. One of the things that crossed my mind was the fact that these bones were found so deep in that cave. And I think Dr. De Silva was under the assumption that they had a real pressing reason to take maybe perhaps a dead individual back in there. But I'm thinking maybe they had other reasons for going back in there in the deep, dark recesses. And I couldn't help but think of the Patterson film again. And I'll show you. This is 3 frames from the Patterson film. And you'll see that this is taken in the early part of the filming. And it's kind of shot from below, straight up, at the rear end of the Patterson subject. And you can see that the hair, right dead center in the middle of the cleavage of the buttocks, is worn off. And it tells me one thing, and it tells me that it spends a great deal of time sitting down and perhaps scooting around until it wears that hair off. And maybe in the same manner as the Homo naledis in that cave in South Africa. Maybe it's an environment that they like, and there's certainly no shortage of it. There's lots and lots of caves in and around that area in the foothills of Mount Shasta in Northern California. Well, Dr. De Silva and his team certainly did some solid work on the fossils of Australopithecus, the different versions of it, on down to Australonaledi, which is reminds me greatly of the Patterson Bigfoot in the film and many of the features that they discovered. And so it begs to question, what are we looking at on that film? Are we looking at a man in a suit, or how could it be a man in a suit? How could Roger Patterson have known that they would discover all of these things in a primitive human that you see on that film taken in 1967? I hope this has provided some food for thought about the Patterson film and what it possibly could be, the true nature of what's on it. There'll be a link to Dr. De Silva's YouTube video, in the description below. So I encourage you to go there, watch the whole thing, and see if it reminds you of the Patterson film. And I thank you for your time.